Did you get your coffee and something a little bit after lunch so we can be alert and enjoy this? There was a no. I want to introduce, first of all, most of you know Tim Frazier. And those of us that know him know he's very passionate about whatever he does, whether it's helping someone in our community with bill pays or trusts or some of the not-so-fun stuff that you've done or talking about his background. He's very passionate in everything he does, so not very surprising to most of us with his book launch and soon to be a children's book he might talk about as well. So, and then Brian's here going to do some question and answer, and at the end we'll offer up for some questions and answers from all of you. So with that, Tim Frazier, Brian Kyle, Chaplain, thank you.
Hey, and we even get applause. That's nice, isn't it? Well, Tim gave me a call a little over a month ago and said he knew I had read his book, and would you kind of help me talk about it and discuss it and kind of do an interview? I said, I'd love to, and I'm going to read it again. So I did, and enjoyed it again. And so I think I'd like to start out, Tim. I'm just excited that you were able to do this. You know, I think in the back here about the author, let me just read this. After nearly 10 years in military service, Timothy Frazier settled in the countryside of Michigan with his wife, son, energetic dog, Rocky, and obsessively hungry cat. Okay. Al, I forgot the name there. He loves that he has been able to create a space for his parents to live with them as one family unit, while Tim continues to work his job in the finance sector. He still finds time to write inspirational books and children's stories. He aspires to teach, motivate, and serve others, empowering them to strive past the unknown and to explore their passions. And that's on page 89 of his book. I think it's just a wonderful summary of who you are. I know as I read the book, the one byline that I caught right away under the subtitle was Finding the Warrior Within. You want to talk about that? Why did you include that?
Yeah. Sure.
I feel like I'm a little high in my volume.
Yeah, we're definitely a little high over there. Got a little feedback. Hopefully it'll go away. So deep down inside, I'm a storyteller. My parents, my mom is Puerto Rican, and so she grew up both in New York and Puerto Rico. And so my family is very indigenous of the rainforest area out there. And so I always grew up around a very storytelling, verbal, this is how we share our life and our family and our experience with each other. And for me, I have been through a lot of different experiences, some good, some bad, some traumatic. And I have used those suffering and experiences to be, one, a place of passion, but also hopefully a place of wisdom to pass on to those around me, to allow them to not experience some of the same things that I experience sometimes, but also to give them a word, a thought, and to connect it with my story. So finding the warrior within was really talking about myself, finding the warrior within myself. You know, I often talk to my wife about what's the difference between inspiring others versus challenging others. And so often I tell my wife, I was like, you're great, you inspire everybody. I said, for me, I challenge everybody, so they're not always wanting to hear what I have to say. Because I'm not just asking people to be inspired for a moment. I'm asking them to take a moment and turn that into one change that could be a change for a lifetime. And that's very different. So I have to use stories. I have to write some of these things down. And for me, it was a legacy. And when I say legacy, what I mean is I put in here some of the stories I might be afraid to share with my own son. The things that we forget, the things that may not be any part of our current story when it comes time for him to have his own set of experiences and needs to learn. And I might not be ready to share some of those things with him. I might be afraid to share those things. Well, rather than taking that fear and being a limiting factor, I said, let this be a part of my legacy now, so that my son sees both the human and the warrior. And he gets to choose who he wants to be and how he wants to learn from me, regardless if he's willing to listen to my voice. He might be able to listen to the words that I wrote down. So that's where that warrior within really came from.
I like that. And your vulnerability just came out in so many ways in the book. And I think that's one thing that I appreciated so much. And we tend to underestimate that in each of our life situations, just how much we've been through. And I made a list of all the things that have been part of your life, the challenging things. Wow. You experienced being a very good athlete, but experienced also disappointment of injury that took you out of that. Discrimination, workplace belittling, illness, job loss, financial trauma, relational trauma. There was the 10 miscarriages that you account for, and then going through the pain of divorce and depression, weight gain that you struggled with, but then spiritual seeking and developing spiritual disciplines and amazing rebound and this supportive marriage you're experiencing now and a son. Maybe you could speak to also, was this a pretty cathartic experience, healing experience writing this book? You've sort of addressed that already a bit.
Sure.
Yeah.
It's interesting because you have to go back and choose to relive things in your life that you didn't necessarily want to relive. Mm-hmm. So that was part one. So that was a call to courage, was the first part of writing this book. It also is a call to mend or readdress the traumas that happened in relationships. Relationships, good, bad, broken, they're part of our stories. They're part of how we have changed. There's things that we have to make amends for. And although I felt like I made amends for it, I had to choose to revisit and make sure I was honoring the other people that I was talking about, because this is my story, not their time that they want to share. So I don't want to put them out there. I don't want to take ownership of what is responsible for them. I wanted to look at myself. And so, honestly, I was experiencing critiquing myself and reevaluating, did I really learn from this experience? I found myself experiencing some of the same emotional traumas, but on the turnaround side of it, I had to go back and revisit, how did I overcome this the first time? Was it just time? What was the steps that I took to overcome this? And by re-evaluating that and talking about those steps of how to overcome or find that warrior within, I found not just a sense of healing, but really a sense of, I have a blueprint to get through the next situation with a sense of wisdom, with a sense of purpose, and with a new cohesiveness with God that I may have not had when I first went through some of these experiences. So in that sense, it was a reaffirmation of my faith and finding that process again of when I discovered my faith and a rekindling of my relationship with God. So it was much more than just healing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and your deep faith, I think, comes through in a very strong way in the book, and yet I think really very authentic too. And just some of your background too, your father was a pastor, did urban ministry, so you were exposed to that at an early age, your military background, and then you served as a chaplain's assistant, where you had to work really with religious traditions really across the spectrum.
Correct.
And you did that for how long? Tell us a little bit about your military.
So one thing I did not get into very deeply in my book was actually my military experience, but I'll share some more now. I'll briefly say the reason why I didn't was because it has a tendency of monopolizing the conversation, or it has a tendency of being romanticized. where people focus on that aspect of your experience and not realizing that there was a man before that experience, during that experience, and after that experience.
Good point.
Within my military experience, I actually stopped a suicide from happening at basic training. A individual had chosen to get off of his medications and had some extreme emotional reactions as a result. And it took a lot of courage being in a place that you didn't know, with drill sergeants who you weren't sure if they were going to yell at you or not yell at you. But you put that thing aside, so to speak, to hone in on what's most important. And so I remember vividly what took place. I won't bore you with all the details or excite you with all of them. But what that did inside of me was make me extremely aware that God has gifted me with words. Both my parents are ordained pastors. My dad has one in urban ministry. He worked primarily with youth. And how do we connect youth with the resources that are part of a community and help them to become a part of it in a new way? My mother was more on the theology side. She has a PhD in theology, but she was looking at different generations. You know, being Latina, she was looking at what happens to the first generation in the U.S., the second generation in the U.S. How do you deal with immigration and the church and some of those types of challenges? So I was always a very brave person in tackling some rather challenging questions that we ask within our faith. So for me, coming into the military, I had a predisposition towards being able to have some of those challenging conversations with people. And with dealing with the suicidal, and then moving into more of the cultural aspects. You see, when you're overseas, the generals are not seen as authority figures in the Muslim traditions. They're looking for someone who is a religious figure. And so the chaplain becomes one of the biggest negotiators. And while many forget that terrorist groups are not vigilantes just running around, they're organized, even if they're not centralized. Organized in the sense that they provide supply chain, food, water. The minute that you disrupt those things, those towns no longer have food, water, education system, supplies. And so somebody needs to talk. Hey, we don't want you to harbor terrorists. If we don't help terrorists, then they think we're helping Americans and then they kill us. That's the narrative. Yeah. How do you negotiate within that space? How do you understand how they're being impacted by war and how that directly impacts our young soldiers walking through a town? Those were the conversations that we had to have. And they could get very sticky sometimes. And oftentimes we were, you had one that was opening arms, welcoming, and another that wasn't. And so I learned from an early age to be very, very aware of those pieces, aware of what cultural aspects were taking place. I moved into GIMS, which is Joint Interagency Missions. That's your three-letter groups, FBI, CIA, NRO, NSA, mixed in with Special Operations Command, your paratroopers, Navy SEALs, Special Operations, Special Forces. And those guys do group missions. And the reason why we got so involved was because I became a consultant to a lot of commanders on the cultural dynamics on ground. And for that reason, I also understood the security routes on ground, because you're having to create security routes for chaplains to meet with different individuals, both in the military and out of the military. So I had a very unique position where it wasn't just a shoot 'em up, bang, bang kind of job. It was about really understanding the cultural and relationship dynamics of war and how it's impacting cultures and nations and in historical dynamics. So you can only understand that when you simplify that, what else is part of that? Finances. And that's how I got into finances, because you have to understand how money moves in these different worlds, how they affect relationships, dynamics, and how they understand their interactions. And so that's where that passion really started from.
Oh, that's wonderful. Yeah, I bet you're starting to form some questions in your mind. So we're gonna get to that. Well, your faith again is just really shines out in the book. But I also appreciate that there is a real inclusiveness in the book. That you are reaching out to folks that maybe would not claim Jesus exclusively. When we talked not too long ago, you know where I'm going to go. I said, now help me to understand. You use sometimes, a number of times, interchangeably, the word God or the universe. Now, within historic Christianity, we've always said, well, no, the universe is the created order. It is other than God. It is temporary. God's eternal. But you really helped me to open my eyes to the new generation, younger generation, how they're using that word universe. And so when folks come across that in your book, so maybe just talk a little bit about that. How are people
Sure.
using that word universe?
It's always hard when you're doing this on the spot. My generation, there's many people of my generation that will call themselves spiritual but not Christian. I don't know if you've heard that before, but that's what my generation says a lot. And one of the reasons why I hear it is because Christianity, good or bad, there was this understanding that there was a limit or a judgment, or this had to be a certain way, and that you were a judgmental person if you were Christian. And for that reason, people were like, no, I'm spiritual. But I would still see them attending church with me every Sunday. And I was like, so help me break this down. And what I learned, and even I understood for myself, was that people didn't have the same barriers to understanding when you use the word universe. It was this idea that God was more than just a personal relationship, but God was also a greater experience. It was a universe experience. There were those who had struggles with, hey, yeah, I have a personal relationship with God, but God's not just a personal, he's micro and macro. Well, what does that mean? How does God and the universe transpires? We share this world with people who do not have the same faith as us. How do we reconcile that? And so for my generation, they were like, oh, we're spiritual. We can at least agree that there are some spiritual seeking that we need to have. Obviously, I am confirmed and devoted to my understanding of what it means to be a Christian and to believe in God. But I didn't want to alienate people with the words and the language that I chose. So what was challenging was to invite Christians into that space, but also those who were discovering their faith. And so I had to figure out, in this flawed language of life, how do we use some words that people may not be accustomed to or who are accustomed to, and be able to allow that to be inviting conversation. And I go back to Paul when he was talking about the unknown God, right? He was using Greek culture, Greek language, Greek understanding to introduce them to the one true God. So in the same essence, I'm using the word universe in the same understanding generationally as what my peers understand, to invite them into a faith experience with me.
Oh, I love that. That was even better than when we talked initially. And Acts 17 and Paul in Athens. And I think it brings up the broader issue, too, that we need to be better as people of faith, as Christian faith, and even beyond that, of asking questions and not making assumptions. So when someone uses a term that we think we know in what context they're using it, ask the question, oh, so what do you mean by that? Or how do you fill that with meaning? And I think that, really opens up conversation. So, but I just think it's a dimension of the book that I appreciated really so much. And, you get in then to the 7 growth stages. You also refer to them as phases. And soil, seed, roots, trunk, branches, fruit, pruning. I always kind of see a little of Jesus' parable of soils in that. So is this then what you just were referring to as kind of a paradigm that, you know, if I'm going to go through all these challenges, I need to have a way to approach them? Is that what you're referring to earlier? Then this is the progression, or is that a little different?
No, I would say that that's the progression of what are the growth stages of developing my faith, developing my understanding around faith, reacquainting myself with my own faith. There are a lot of things that my parents prepared me for. And there's also a lot of things they didn't prepare me for. What I mean by that is our family dynamics teach us.
Someone's cell phone.
Well, we'll figure it out.
Oh, okay.
Our family dynamics teach us how to think about things and how to make decisions around things. So what I had to do in my life was to really take the Bible and not just, I almost call it like Bible roulette, where sometimes you close the Bible, you open it up, and it's like, this is what God wanted to share with me today. How does this apply to today?
That could be dangerous.
Right? Good or bad? I'm sure at least one of us has done it at least once, maybe twice.
And Judas went out and hung himself.
Yeah. True story. I got lost in the woods when I was 13 years old. I was in North Carolina in the Appalachian Mountains, kind of that portion of it. And I got lost in the woods. There was a trail that just kind of dissipated over time. So I'm lost in the woods. I have no idea where I am. It's starting to rain. And I thought to myself, God will send me a savior somewhere. And so I saw this squirrel, and I was like, perfect. God sent me a squirrel. I'm going to go follow that squirrel. And the squirrel went up a tree, and I got lost, and it was worse. Then I was like, no, God's going to send me something, right? It kept raining and everything else. And then I saw a bear, actually. It was a moving rock. And I had already figured out I was walking in circles because I was definitely a little desperate. I was like, oh, a moving rock. And then it turned and looked at me, and I said, oh, not a moving rock. And then there was another little light with a little baby bear looking at me. Grunted, left. And I said, well, that was definitely God. But I still don't know where I'm going. It wasn't until I decided to be still and to listen that I heard a train in the distance. And when I heard that train, that was the direction I ended up traveling. Ended up at an assisted living facility. Everybody was cracking up at me because I was trying to explain to them why I got lost. Had my first experience in a Porsche because I got picked up in a Porsche, and everybody was frightened because I had been lost for 6 hours and landed over 12 miles away from the original place. But remember, you're in mountains, so who knows how we measure distance. So that was that experience. I bring that to light to say I had to stop and listen. How do we learn to listen in the noise of our lives, especially when we don't know what we're listening for? I think that the Christian culture, we use a lot of things and we kind of take it for granted. Oh, God told me this, or I heard the voice of God, and this is where I feel the direction is in my life. Or, you know, you just give it all to God. Well, how do you actually give it to God? How do you actually hear God? What is that process for you? Are you hearing God, or are you hearing your own internal talk? What's the difference? And so for me, I relied on being able to tell the difference between my internal talk and God's voice. When you're overseas, and I did experience some pretty extreme things that I don't talk about in the book, to prevent people from hearing all the gruesome things that can take place, knowing the difference between your voice and God's voice is essential. When I came home, I felt empty because you feel like you have this sense of, you're rewarded for surviving, and you're rewarded for being, in essence, a controlled space of being out of control. What I mean by that is you're extremely powerful. Taking someone's life, choosing to be willing to take someone's life, you are past normal limiters and restrictions of what it means to be human. And so you pass that so often that that limiter, at least initially, isn't there. There's nothing that stops you except your mind or your heart or something that leads you. So when you live a life literally with zero boundaries on what you are able to do, and it's justified because you're doing it in the name of, pro Deo et patria, for God and country, how do you redefine yourself? How do you rehear God's voice? How do you rekindle that direction in life when all your friends are just as lost as you are? There was no community to come back to. There was no space that said, hey, I got you. Hey, Tim, don't bring a firearm to the church picnic. Just leave it in the car. Or, hey, maybe we shouldn't go out there and do X, Y, and Z. That's military talk. Let's do it this way. There was nothing. And so you found yourself, looking at the shiny things and this and that with no sense of control. So this book was really about, how did I find that? And it wasn't just how did I find it, but really, how did I really know that God was there when my community wasn't? In that time of returning, there was a failure. There was nobody catching us. And if you didn't come back semi-sane, good luck. And then there was people who could help you in support groups, but unless you're 100% disabled, well, you're a functioning person. How do you rebuild? And so even though I don't talk about necessarily the military experience, I said someone needs to know how to do this. We need a blueprint on how to find our faith. We need a blueprint on how to recognize God in our own lives. It's like trying to describe a color that no one's ever seen before. And so that was really the challenge, is how do I simplify, but also invite people into a space to identify a color or their faith or God, something that they've never recognized before, and hear it through my own story. That's really what I was hoping to accomplish while challenging the reader.
Yeah. And maybe one last thing before we open up the questions. You had one statement, what assets do you have right now? And I just found that pretty provocative and maybe really constructive. So what assets do you have right now?
That question came from, I was in college, my freshman year. I had torn both my patella tendons, that's the tendon right in the middle, and I had to have surgery on both my knees at the same time and ended up in a wheelchair for some period of time. And I was complaining to my dad. And if you know my dad, he's 100% disabled. He has MS. And so he went from being, he got hurt at Olympic trials to being in an electric wheelchair today. I remember my dad listening to me, and my dad is almost zero, never critiques me. Anytime he critiqued me, I pretty much just ignored him anyways. But this one time, I listened, and he said, if I only had half of your ability, what I could achieve. Don't tell me what you can't do. Tell me what you can do. What assets do you have? What is it that is available? And so as you read my story and some of the things, there's a moment where I ruptured my appendix and didn't know it, and I ended up ruptured for 5 days. Nearly died in the hospital.
That's
and when I got out,
infection.
It was the day I was supposed to start a brand new job, so I had no job. I had no insurance. I was $100,000 in debt. And this was, hey, welcome to adulthood experience.
Yeah.
My parents weren't even in the state. They couldn't necessarily send me money, and I was here in Michigan. So I used to sleep over at the Meyer on Knapp's Corner, and then there's a rest stop between 10 and 14 Mile going southbound on the 131 that I used to sleep at.
Yeah.
And I remember being cold because it was November, December, January, and February of 2008 to 2009. March was when I joined the military.
Yeah.
And I remember sitting in my car being real cold and not wanting to turn on the car because that meant that I was using gas and I didn't know how to put my money into the gas tank. And so I'm trying to figure this out. You know, it's cold. It was negative something degrees. I remember it was -6 because you could see that bounce back from the light when it's that cold. When you see it bouncing back off of the ground and shining back up to the street lights and things of that nature, when you see that, you know it's real cold, okay? And I remember just going, what assets do I have right now? And in that silence, I remember saying time. I might not have money. Most people say I can't get a better job because I don't have enough time. I don't have enough time to find or look for this. I was like, I have all the time in the world. So what am I going to do with all that time? And that was the reawakening of my soul.
Wow, yes. Well, I think we should open for questions. Joe, you're kind of ready to do that? Okay, and Cheryl, too, over here. So what would you like to ask Tim? Ruth over here.
Would you say a little bit more about the connection between several ways of expressing it? I think you just lastly said, what are your assets? But what is the connection between gratitude and economy? Having enough money. When I think at times, well, I don't have enough resources to do this, that, or the other thing. I really appreciated your asset mentioned as time, and also stop. And that in our culture is really basically, I think, countercultural. So could you just comment a little bit more about that?
Sure.
In whatever way is helpful for you to do that. Thank you.
Thank you for your question. And I really appreciate that because, I'll start off by saying I started as a young banker. I worked for Chase, moved into business banking, then private banking for JP Morgan. And we always used to have this line that says, hey, while I'm looking over your accounts, I'm also going to be looking for ways of saving you time and or money. And that was the catchphrase. And one of the things that always bothered me was the fact that time and money were like on the same pendulum, but they shouldn't be. They're not opposites. What did I miss? And I think you hit it on the spot when you said gratitude and economy. I think that the rarest gift in the world, and hear me out completely, one of the rarest gifts in the world is gratitude. And what I mean by that is not a forced gratitude, but a genuine gratitude without any strings attached, right? Usually we're thankful because someone did something for us, or we're thankful because of something else. When you're grateful because you're grateful, because you feel that sense of blessedness, even when nothing has done anything in your life, that is actually a form of worship. Prayer is like if you had a whole bunch of empty cups like this, and you pray for a specific need, and God is like the water and fills that specific need. When you worship, it's like a floodgate that fills all those waters and then overpours. That's, to me, is the understanding of gratitude, is because you are overflowing with something that is so abundant in your life. So when I think about my understanding of monies and economy and those types of things, if I had a limiting understanding of money always, it doesn't matter if I'm a millionaire or if I'm short with money, and in that sentence and situation, $100,000 in debt, trying to figure out what to do next, I had zero perception if I had looked at it from a limiting standpoint, right? And so instead, no matter what would happen, I would never feel the sense of gratitude or overflowingness or any level of abundance. So what happened for me in that situation was I said, I have time. And so what am I going to do with the time? I stretched out every single conversation I had with debtors on the phone. Hey, I don't have the money. I'm actually living out of my car right now. What do I do? Oh, what do other people do? How do they do that? What steps do they take? Why do they take those steps? It wasn't because I even really cared about my questions all the time, even though it helped me. It was because I knew I had time and they didn't, and they were gonna I was gonna draw out that conversation. But what did I learn? I learned how to write letters of hardship. I got monies forgiven from the hospitals. I looked up all the board members on the hospital. I looked up every single person a part of the hardship process. I looked up which board members were alumni of Calvin, because I graduated from Calvin. I called up the person who was related to the alumni board and everything else like that to find out what mattered to them and why. Then I wrote a long letter. All that time turned into that money being forgiven and wiped out like this. Within a week, I got a letter that says $45,000 forgiven. You owe nothing. Gratitude, right? Would I have had that gratitude if I said, oh, I can't do it? I owed all this money. How's it going to come from the sky, God? Waiting for my squirrel that's going to give me $100,000. Maybe I'll get a lottery ticket. Maybe that'll save me. No. I had to listen, and I forced myself to take all that time. What else did I do? Took time with this. What ended up happening out of all that debt was I only ended up owing $10,000 out of that $100,000. That's still a lot for somebody who doesn't have any money, by the way. Okay? But that person, they said, here's what you're going to do. You're going to call every month and reevaluate the debt. And I said, well, why would I do that? They said, because then they have to re-bill you a certain way because of the conversation, and they're going to code it this way. And so you're going to say this, and that will force them to code it this way. That'll make it restart, which means they have 60 days before they can send you a statement again. And all you have to do is pay a minimum of $5. So every 60 days, I paid $5. And then as soon as I went to basic training, I paid that whole thing off with all my basic training money. Time was my asset. Did I ever get a single dollar in my pocket during that whole time for that 100,000? No. Did God give me some magical thing that came out of the sky? No. But I allowed myself to worship God before anything took place. I allowed myself to be filled with the essence of gratitude. When you allow yourself to be filled with worship before something takes place, it actually provides you what you need for when it takes place. God always works in the opposite direction, isn't that right? Right? We want to see things, and God's telling me hear it first. So that's my answer to your question.
Another question? Oh, I see a couple of hands. It's June right here. And then Marcy after that. Yeah. Oh, okay.
We know that words have different meanings, and I'd like you to tell us a little more what you mean by the word warrior.
Warrior.
Warrior. So warrior, old school military, they used to be able to call you a lot of names. And I was of the generation between old school army and new school army. Old school army, you could still hit people. Okay? Old school Marines, they would put you in a room and they'd file you in. Your drill sergeant could, or drill instructor for Marines, they could wail on you and then pull you out the other end. Okay, that's old school military. It was, you have to be tough because you're going to deal with people who are going to have no mercy for you. When I got into new school and old school mix, they would call us names that couldn't necessarily be seen as negative. But instead, because we weren't soldiers yet, they called us warriors. They're like, you're going to go into your war locker. Listen up, young warriors. But what that instilled in us was this feeling of, this is my identity. I am a warrior. I am strong. I'm a member of a team. I serve the people of the United States. I live the Army values, right? I'm disciplined, physically and mentally tough, trained and proficient in my warrior tasks and drills, right? Warrior ethos, what does that mean, right? Warrior ethos, and you start looking at, I will never quit. I will never leave a fallen comrade. Some of these types of things are part of our warrior ethos. And so the idea of a warrior was, hey, I may not be these things completely yet, but when I put on that uniform, I am. And so the idea of finding the warrior within was this understanding that it's not going to just be my uniform, it's going to be who I am. Because for a long time, it was like, you think about police officers. Are they police officers when they just put on their uniform? No, they're police officers even when they're off duty. Is a soldier a soldier a soldier a soldier? I wasn't at the time. I had to become one. And so it was only when I put on that uniform that I was a soldier, where I held those values and I held that mindset. When I took it off, if I made mistakes, oh well. But while I'm wearing that uniform, I'm a soldier, and this is what it means. And eventually became part of my identity. So the idea of finding a warrior within was the idea of saying, I'm going to find my identity in Christ. Well, what does your identity in Christ means? It means that you're willing to suffer. Does it mean you're willing to be a warrior for God? Does it mean that you're willing to stand up for Christ? Does it mean that you're willing to stand up for what you believe in? Does it mean that you're willing to stand? Or is it just your identity and no longer just a willing, it just is? And that's what it meant to me to be a warrior. It was the sense that I am. I'm going to find that I am, be that I am, and find that identity in Christ, so that there's not God and then myself. It's literally saying, hey, God is really inside me. That is what that means.
So outward actions become an inward reality. Other questions? A really tough one.
Well, thank you very much, Tim. I think you'll be here for a little bit if someone has some more questions. Very, very powerful and supportive of you. And we appreciate you taking time out. Very much appreciate your time, taking time to do this.
Thank you. For those who did ask questions, I do want to give you all a free copy of the book.
Oh, I have a question.
Oh, wow. So many questions.
What did you dedicate your book to?
I'm going to read it because I want you to... Because I actually had a hard time figuring this out. I rededicated the book 5 times. What I ended up saying was, to honor and to serve you, the reader, may you see my heart, my vulnerability, and learn a bit about why I fell in love with God.
Wow.
To answer your question. One more question?
I really hesitate this because I'm afraid that I don't know what I'm afraid of. But I've paid for the book, so I'm not asking a question just to get a book. You talk about the warrior, and is there ever a war inside of you by opposing ideas, forces? Christ died on the cross. Satan didn't. I am convinced that his activity is as real, probably more so than any time ever in history. And that's the kind of war that goes on in the mind and in who you are. Does that make any sense?
It does. And I'm not sure if my answer will suffice, but what I'm going to do is break it down into two separate things. First and foremost, there are two different wars within that I do discuss in my book. And I don't create a paradigm the way that I'm doing it right now, but for the sake of the question, I will. One is, how much is you fighting you? And how much do we give credit to, we'll say, to sin and Satan? I focus a little bit more on the internal struggles because I believe that some of them are informed, good or bad, by outside things that influence us. And when you hit those rock bottom moments and we're struggling and we're looking for peace and we're looking for things in our lives and we're reaching out, or at least for me, I was reaching out and grabbing things. I didn't always grab the right things. And so part of addressing those things in this book was saying, hey, what am I ashamed of? What do I still wrestle with? What do I still need to heal from? Where is it that I need to find, or should I say, arise in? And arise means to not just get up again, but to emerge into something greater and different than what you were before. That is the story of Christ. The Christ was not just here to say, hey, I forgive you of your sins. Great, go and sin no more. There was a second part to it, right? There was this idea of, okay, now that we have salvation, what now? What version of ourselves are we living? Are we living an old version or a redeemed version? Are we living an old version or a baptized version of ourselves? Now that we are anew in Christ, now that we are washed of our sins, what does that mean now? What version of ourselves do we choose to live in? Does that mean that we're totally negated from ever having conflicts internally? Absolutely not. Paul talks about that in Romans and whatnot. But the idea is that we are delivered and that we have a choice. And I talk about what does it take to have a process to find that reason why we had that choice over and over again. Addiction is a very powerful thing. And some people can become addicted to the wrong choice, and they might make the right choice Monday, but can they make the right choice on Tuesday and on Wednesday and on Thursday and on Friday until the character of who you are is to make the right choice, even if there's a voice inside of you saying, hey, go check that out. And so what I talk about in the book has more to do with saying, how do we change that pattern and create a new pattern that is seeking Christ always? And how did I do that? Or how did God's grace allow me to find that within myself? Now, within that, there are very much things that I would say is Satan. Although I don't focus on that, I focus on the internal battles here. I thought very heavily about creating another book where I talked about those things, but that would rely a lot more on my military experience. And I wasn't sure how to invite people in that space. Because that to me was, I was going to have Faith Arising, and then I was going to have Faith, a bonds and chains story. And that was going to be the second book to this, looking at the bonds which are more internal and the chains which are the external things that we find ourselves in. Those are some of the heaviest burdens of our heart. So I understand your question. I don't think I fully answered it with my answer. But what I say is, yes, I talk about the struggles. Finding a warrior within really leads me to the Henry Ford quote, which says something to the effect of, I have it on my phone, but I think it's Henry Ford said something in the regards of, if I am focused on what I'm afraid of versus focused on my goals, is what the Henry Ford quote is about, and someone can look it up. The idea is that when you focus on your goals, you're not focused on what you're afraid of. You're not focused on those things that can be setbacks in your life. And so finding the warrior within is really about saying, what is my focus? I might make mistakes along the way. I might have some internal mental battles along the way, but if I'm keeping my eyes on Jesus, if I'm keeping my eyes on a goal, and I am fixated on that, it's very hard to lose sight. It's very hard to become misdirected by fears. And so the idea of a warrior, and the reason why it says I will never quit, I will never feel a fallen comrade, you know, and all of those types of things that we talk about with the warrior ethos, it's this idea that as a warrior, we don't stop just because the battle was lost. We didn't stop being a warrior. We didn't stop being a soldier or having the sense of duty, respect, honor, and integrity, personal courage, sense of leadership, just because everything around us fell apart. That's not why we stand up. That's not why we're warriors. We're warriors because we chose to be, regardless of the circumstance. There are many circumstances that I would say were more than just a losing battle. We lost and we failed. And yet we chose to stand up and be warriors and not accept that defeat. It wasn't denial. It was this understanding that this is who we are. We're warriors. That is our identity. We don't stop just because we lost the battle. So that's the best way I can answer that question for you.
Henry Ford, obstacles are those frightful things you see when you take your eyes off your goal.
There you go.
Read it again, would you please?
Yeah, obstacles are those frightful, thank you. Obstacles are those frightful things you see when you take your eyes off your goal.
Anyone else questions? Tim, we really want to thank you because I think that, you know, somebody will say we've all been through traumas, and when you find that moment to pivot and share is what helps each of us get on to the next step and grow and trust and love one another and love the Lord. So thank you very much.